Welcome to the congregation of Yahweh. We're here on Yahweh's Sabbath day. Greetings to those on the internet and those live. We hope the messages are a blessing. Today's message is entitled The Bondage of the Flesh. And there's a few places in the Messianic New Testament scriptures that talk about bondage. And some don't jump to the conclusion that they're all talking about the same thing. And it's actually taken out of context in a few places. And I want to touch on those. And we're going to end up in chapters that I spent a lot of time in, which is Romans 6, 7, and 8. But I want to cover some of these bondage verses and see if we can get a feel of what it's actually saying. And a lot of people, you know, when you're talking about obedience to his instructions, you know, they say, oh, Paul is really plain on this. You need to just read Paul, and it's really plain and easy to understand what he has to say. But the truth of the matter is, Paul's not really that easy to understand. And Peter gave us a really good warning that Paul was deep, and that that people actually twisted his words to their own destruction. And he went on to say, do not follow the example of those lawless ones who are twisting the writings of Paul to their own destruction as they do the other scriptures. But in Acts chapter 15, and I'm not going to read all the sections on these verses, we'll just kind of highlight the verse and then kind of get to the context of what was actually going on. We could read Acts 15 and verse 10. And it says, now therefore, why tempt you Elohim to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? Now we could read that one verse and say, you see, if you try to get his people to obey, that's just putting a yoke on their neck. You're trying to bring them into bondage. But if we back it up just a little bit, in verse 1 of chapter 15, we see what the context is. And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. And they went on to have a dispute about it. In verse 7, Peter stands up and says, and when there had been much disputing, Peter rose up and said unto them, men and brethren, you know how that a good while ago Elohim made choice among us that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the good news and believe. They heard the word of the good news and they believed. And Elohim, which knows the hearts, bear them witness, giving them the Holy Spirit, even as he did unto us, and put no difference between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. Now, why are you trying to put that yoke, the yoke of be circumcised and keep the customs of Moses before you can be saved? That was the yoke they was trying to put on them. Let's flip over to Galatians. We'll see this same thing being repeated. Galatians chapter 2. Now in this story, the disciples were actually witnessing and fellowshipping with those of the nations, the Gentiles. And there's actually, you know, a very deep theology that leads up to what was going on with the Gentiles and why the Gentiles were coming into the faith, but we're not discussing that here today. But in chapter 2, verse 1, then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me also, and I went up by revelation and communicated unto them that good news which I preached amongst the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, and that because of false brethren unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty, which we have in Messiah Yeshua, that they might bring us into bondage. And today we hear people, if you talk about obedience, you're automatically a Pharisee or a Judaizer. But that's because they don't understand the context of what was going on. These people were trying to convert people to obedience to all the instructions before they could have salvation. And we know that is bondage. Let me flip over here to... Okay, in verse 11, we see that, but when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was to be blamed. For before the certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles, but when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews disassembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. And this all stems back to a good understanding of this is when Peter had his vision of the clean and unclean. The three traditionally called unclean men were coming to him, and when he came, he went with the three men into the house of Cornelius, and he said, it is unlawful for me, being a Jew, to come in and associate with those of another nation. But Yahweh showed me I should call no man unclean. So after he had this revelation, here in the book of Galatians, he's actually withdrawing from them, fearing those of the circumcision. And they go on to conclude that a man is not justified by his works of the law, but he's justified by faith. And read a couple more scriptures. In chapter 3, while we're in the book of Galatians, this is another easily misread verse, chapter 3, verse 13. Messiah hath redeemed us from the curse of the law. I actually had somebody come to my house one time, knock on the door, and want to discuss the scriptures, and I was like, sure, come on in. And we were talking about the Torah, and he said that the law was a curse. I said, really? You mean the same scriptures that is a blessing, that was cause you to live long in the land and keep the diseases off of you? Those laws were a curse, and this verse was used to defend that. He has redeemed us from the curse of the law. It doesn't say he redeemed us from the law that was a curse. The curse of the law, when you broke it, had a death penalty on it, depending on which part of the law you broke. And that curse was hanged on the tree. That's what he took to the stake, was the punishment. It says he became sin for us who knew no sin, and he also became a curse for us. And that's what he redeemed us from. Continue on. Here's another verse talking about something totally different, but some of the wording sounds similar. In chapter 4 of verse 8. And verse 8 actually identifies what the rest of the verses are talking about. Howbeit then, when you knew not Yahweh, when you didn't know him, you did service unto them which by nature are no mighty ones. You were serving deities that were not mighty ones, were not Elohim. But now, after that you have known Elohim, or rather are known of Elohim, how turn you again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and times and years. People actually use this as a defense against Yahweh's feast days. You talk about Passover or Pentecost or anything like that, they say, you see, this verse right here says those things are bondage. And that's the days and the months and the times. You're trying to go back to that old Jewish stuff. But we see what days and times it's referring to in verse 8. The things they were doing when they didn't know Yahweh. idolatrous services. Those are the days they were trying to go back and observe. So the feast days that were given to Israel for them to keep throughout their generations and forever are not the weak and beggarly elements. And there's one more verse in chapter 5, verse 1. Actually, there's another one. In chapter 4, verse 21. Tell me, you that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise, which things are an allegory. For these are the 2 covenants, the one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Agar. For this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. And there's a real good verse in Romans chapter 9 that illustrates this bondage and what he's talking about between these 2 covenants. Let me go over to, I'm coming back to Galatians, but I'm going to Romans chapter 9 real quick. And verse 30. Romans 9, verse 30. What shall we say then? That the Gentiles, which followed not after righteousness, hath attained to righteousness, even the righteousness which is of faith. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not attained to the law of righteousness. Wherefore, because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. For they stumbled at the stumbling stone. As it is written, Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed. So if we try to trust in our own righteousness, we shall fall, and that is bondage, trying to attain your own righteousness. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 1, Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Messiah hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, Messiah shall profit you nothing. Now that doesn't mean if you're circumcised, there's no profit. It actually means if you're trusting in your circumcision for righteousness to save you, that won't profit you anything. Now let's go over to Romans in Romans chapter 7. I'm going to read a couple verses here. I'm going to start off in Romans 6. Chapter 7, verse 6. And this kind of it could follow the same thinking with these other bondage verses, and it could lead somebody to believe that, this is all talking about the same thing. But here is something totally different. In chapter 7, verse 6, But now we are delivered from the law. It almost sounds like you're delivered from that bondage thing, but it's a little bit deeper. And we're going to backtrack just a little bit to find out what this means. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held. Something held us, and we were delivered from that. Something held us associated to the law, and we're delivered from that. Now, in Romans chapter 8 and verse 2, it says, For the law of the Spirit of life in Messiah Yeshua hath made me free from the law of sin and death. Now, there are some that take this law of sin and death and they throw that all throughout the interpretation of Romans chapter 7. But I disagree with that, and I'll show you why here in just a second. But let's back it up to Romans chapter 6, and we'll build up to the context of what he's actually saying there. In chapter 6, verse 1, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Shall we continue to transgress so his grace would be that much more mighty? Certainly not. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? We're dead to it. How shall we continue to do it? So what does it mean to be dead to sin? Know you not that so many of us as were baptized into Yeshua Messiah were baptized into his death? Therefore, we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Messiah was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. Buried into his death so that we could walk in newness of life. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall be also in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old man is impaled with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin. The old man has to die so that from now on we're not slaves of sin. Think about that. That's what we're leading up to. The old man has to die so that we're not slaves to sin anymore. And that is the bondage that he's talking about that we need to be set free from. Our inherited nature, what we're born into. When Adam created after his kind, he was already in sin. And we inherited that, and we're in bondage to that. We have to be set free from that, and that's done through the Messiah. For he that is dead, old man, is freed from sin. Now, if we be dead with Messiah, we believe that we shall also live with him, knowing that Messiah, being raised from the dead, dies no more. Death hath no more dominion over him. For in that he died unto sin once, but in that he lives unto Elohim. Likewise, reckon ye also yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto Elohim through Yeshua Messiah our Master. Let not sin therefore reign or rule in your mortal body, that you should obey it in the lusts thereof. Something caught my attention here as I was meditating on this. Other than verse 1, every verse we just read talked about death. Every single verse that we read up until this point, besides the first one, was talking about something dying, something dead. Just for the sake of time, let's go over here to verse 16. Know you not that to whom you yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants you are, to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death, or of obedience unto righteousness. So are you going to obey the old man who was in bondage to sin? Or are you going to obey Yahweh, which results in righteousness? But Elohim be thanked that you were the servants or slaves of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. Being then made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. And right now, I want to go over here to 1 Timothy, and he shows the old man who is under the law. 1 Timothy chapter 1, and this is what we want to be delivered from. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8, but we know that the law is good. Remember that phrase right there. The law is good, because we're going to revisit that phrase again in just a minute. Matter of fact, he repeats it several times. But we know that the law is good if a man use it lawfully, knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the wicked, for sinners, for unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for whoremongers, for them that defile themselves with mankind, for men stealers, for liars, for perjured persons, and if there be any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine. The law was made for anybody that wants to break it. That was the role of the law. That's what defines what sin is. And another witness to that is in Romans 3:20. It says, "By the law is the knowledge of sin." Romans 7:7. I had not known covetousness except the law. I had not known lust except the law had said, "Thou shalt not covet." And 1 John 3:4. Sin is transgression of the law. So the purpose of his instructions was not for a righteous person that wants to live by it. It's for people that want to disobey it. And we need to be delivered from the human aspect that wants to disobey, the rebellious nature. Back to Romans. Be closing out here in just a minute. We're going to pick back up in Romans chapter 7 with the mind frame that Paul has put into us so far in chapter 6, that the old man has to die, that the law is good, obedience is good, and that the old man was bondage. He gives a really good illustration here in chapter 7 about what is bound to the law. Know you not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law. Talking to people who are knowledgeable in his instructions. How that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he lives. As long as a man is alive, the law has dominion over him. It applies to him as long as he is living. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband, so long as he lives. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband lives she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. Wherefore, my brethren, you also are become dead to the law. Now, in chapter 6, he talked about being dead to sin. Here, he's talking about being dead to the law. Now, there's a relationship. The law defines what sin is. The rebellious nature wants to transgress it. And that's what he's leading up here to, being delivered from the rebellious nature that wants to transgress. Wherefore, my brethren, you also are become dead to the law. Now this is talking about the old man. By the body of Messiah, that you should be married to another, even to him. And who's supposed to be married to another? The new man. The old man dies to the sin, and the one that wants to transgress against the law, the new man gets married, the new nature, the new person, the one that's resurrected, the one that's changed, the new creature, the new creation, the one that behold, all things have become new. That one. By the body of Messiah, that you should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto Elohim. Now he's going to backtrack. For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sin, which were by the law. That means the passion of sin, which was by the law, did work in our members, our body, to bring forth fruit unto death. There was a passion to sin that came by the law. And I usually read this afterwards, but I'm going to read this verse real quick as we go along in this chapter 7. I'm flipping over here to 1 Corinthians 15 just for a second. And then I'm coming right back. In 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 56, it says, the sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. The strength of sin is the law. The law gives sin its strength. Well, the law says what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. The rebellious nature says, I want to do it anyway. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held. What held us? The old man, the rebellious nature that wanted to rebel against the law. That we should serve in newness of spirit and not in oldness of letter. The spirit is our drive to obey. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? That's another verse, by the way, that's tore apart and taken out of context. That we should serve in newness of spirit, not in oldness of letter. Some will say, I don't need to obey the letter because I got the spirit. Well, actually, the Messiah gives us a good illustration of what that means in Matthew chapter 5. You have heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say, if you look upon a woman and lust after her, you've committed adultery in your heart already. If you obey the Spirit, you will not transgress the letter. Verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. The law is not sin. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law, for I had not known lust except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. But sin, rebellion, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. For without the law, sin was dead. If there is no law, there is no sin. If he hadn't have said, don't eat from the tree, it wouldn't have been a sin if they ate from the tree. If the law doesn't define what sin is, there is no sin and there's no rebellious nature to transgress it. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, worked in me all kinds of evil desires. That's what that means there. And this sin taking occasion by the commandment is exactly what he said in verse 5, the motion of sin which was by the law. Verse 9. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. The commandment was supposed to be life and blessing and health and to be at peace with your enemies and all that. But because of the rebellious nature, he found it to be unto death because of what was in him. Here he says it again. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. Here we go. Wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. His instructions are good. And he's about to go on to say, because what is in me is so bad, it's proof that his instructions are good. Verse 13. Was then that which is good, his instructions, made death unto me? Certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. He's saying that, the law pointed out the sin, and sin came through the commandment, but it pointed it out and made it exceedingly sinful. It magnified it. It showed where the human nature was. Verse 14, for we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. And I always have to cross-reference that verse with another one. 7:14 says we know that the law is spiritual, and 8 and 5 says, for they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, but they that are after the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. I wish he would have put those right beside each other. But anyway, verse 15, for that which I do, the things that I do, I allow not. I mean, I tell other people not to do it. He's about to talk about the battle between the flesh and the Spirit. For what I want to do, this is what I don't do. But what I hate, this is what I do. If then I do that which I don't want to do, I consent unto the law that it is good. As long as human beings are transgressing, it is proof that the law is good. As long as evil desire is in the world, it is proof that Yahweh's instructions are good. Now then, it is no more I that do it, but the sin, the rebellion that is dwelling inside of us. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwells no good thing. For to will, that means the desire, is present with me, but how to perform that which is good, I find not. Meaning I have a desire to do the right thing, but I can't figure out how to do it. And keep in mind that in verse 5 it says, when we were in the flesh. When we were in the flesh. I had a desire to do the right thing, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. Verse 19, for the good that I want to do, I do not. But the evil which I don't want to do, this is what I do. I'm doing the evil that I don't want to do. And, you know, anyway, verse 21. I find then, verse 20. Now if I do that I don't want to do, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwells in me. I find in a law that when I want to do good, evil is present with me. For I delight in the law of Yahweh after the inward man, but I see another law in my members, in my body, warring against the law of my mind. Now, right here where he says, I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, I believe that's the law of sin and death, which he goes on to discuss. And the law of sin and death, this is just theory here, the law of sin and death is what we inherited. After Adam and Eve sinned and everything was made after its kind, after that, the law of sin and death was put in order. For because he sinned, death and sin passed upon all men. And that's in Romans chapter 5. Verse 24. O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death? What body? The old man. I thank Elohim through Yeshua Messiah our Master. So then with my mind, I myself serve the law of Elohim, but with my flesh, the law of sin. There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Messiah Yeshua, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. For the law of the Spirit of life in Messiah Yeshua hath made me free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, couldn't save, and it couldn't make them righteous. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, it only pointed out sin. Yahweh sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin condemned sin in the flesh. He put a stop to sin ruling in the flesh. How? Through the power of the Spirit. Why? Verse 4. That the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. That's an amazing verse and very hard to overlook. The previous verses, all this happened so that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk after the flesh, but after the Spirit. Hallelujah.